Let's take a look at how we can use a reference image as a guide to create a painting in Corel Painter 2015 without cloning or auto-painting. So I have my image open here in Corel Painter. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Select All, I'm going to go to Copy, and then I'm going to create a new document. You can make that any size you want. You want to think about which size you're going to print this at. So I've made this 8x10 at 300 dpi, but you could use any size canvas you want. And then we're going to go to Paste in Place. You can just use Paste as well. And then I'm going to use Free Transform to scale this up so that it fits in my canvas here. Now, to avoid squashing this, you want to hold Shift and then drag this corner. Keep holding Shift and drag down the other corner, and you'll notice that holding Shift keeps this from squishing. And what I mean by squishing is if I let go of Shift, I can squish it and squash it. If I keep holding Shift, it locks it back into place. So I'm going to position it so it fills my canvas and then let go of Shift and let my pen up. It's going to look a little blocky until I click this checkbox here. And this was a really small image. You're probably going to have a better image to work with, but this was the only public domain photo of roses that I could find. And you can go ahead and name this reference. Now you want to turn down the opacity of that reference layer and keep that reference layer as the topmost layer while you paint. That'll ensure that you'll always be able to see your reference while you're painting. I'm going to keep this a little more opaque so that it shows up on your side better, and then I'm going to go ahead and start painting. Now I want all of my layers, I'm going to use layers a lot in this to separate out my colors and my shapes. These layers are all going to be below the reference layer. So I'm going to create a new layer. We can separate this by object or by color. Now you want to work from the background to the foreground. So these roses in the background should be lower in the layer order here. And then the objects that are closer in the foreground, like this leaf, would be up near the top. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's do a layer for roses background. I'm just going to do BG for short. And we can go ahead and start painting. I'm going to use the scratch board for this. I'm going to just go ahead and block in all of these basic colors first, and then add the details later. And it might help to load this as a reference image in your reference image palette. You can find that in the window menu under reference image. You can click the load button in the bottom left corner, select your reference image, and then you'll be able to see it with all of its colors. Now you don't have to use these same colors. You could of course change that, and you don't have to copy the photo exactly. This photo is just a guide. So on that roses BG layer, I know I'm going to want this general pink color. Helps if you blur your eyes and you look at your reference photo, because that'll help you see less detail. So that general pink color, I know that's going to be somewhere here in the hue. I like to pick the hue first. And then I pick the value and intensity of that color. So I'm going to go with something like that. Maybe shift it a little bit more towards purple. Let's try that and see. So now if I paint with that on these roses in the background, you'll see that I can still see my reference image. I'm not going to worry about doing detail because these are kind of out of focus. I'm just going to put in some pink blobs, which we can refine later. So that's enough for that. We'll create another layer. Let's do what's behind that. Let's do that dark black area. So we'll just call this dark. Now it looks black in the photo, but you don't necessarily have to use black. I'm going to use a really dark blue because I think that'll look a little more artistic. This is going to be the darkest value in the piece, so you want to make sure that it's pretty dark and that as you move into the foreground, all of the dark colors are lighter in value than your darkest color. So if you look in your value here, you can see this is a value of 13. So if we were to pick a dark pink for this area here in the shadow, we'd want to make sure that that is brighter in value. So I'm going to go ahead and fill in that dark area. Background, you'll notice that since this color is on a separate layer from the dark layer, I don't have to worry about painting over this pink. It's in front of this dark that I'm putting in. Now, using these layers might seem weird at first, but this is going to make it a lot easier for you to paint and make changes. And there's less risk. You know that if for some reason you don't like one of these layers, you can always change it. Let's go ahead and create another layer. We'll move that above roses BG, we'll call it roses foreground. And if we want to get that original pink color that we had there, we'll have to hide our reference image temporarily by clicking on the eyeball. And we'll hold Alt on the keyboard or Option on Mac and click to select that pink. Let's just make it a little bit brighter so that it stands out in front of the layer behind it. Turn your reference back on. Make sure you're painting on the roses foreground layer. And then go ahead and start blocking that in. You just want the general shapes of these flowers because you're going to add the fine details later. You don't want to be too sloppy about this, but you also don't want to waste time adding too much detail. Again, you want this to look just like the general color scheme of what's going on. It doesn't have to be a finished drawing at this point. You just want to block in the general colors. So all of this is going to be mostly pink. Of course, there's going to be some lighter and darker areas, but those will be added later. You just want to cover up all the white, basically. And anywhere you missed a spot, go ahead and go back to the appropriate layer, sample the color using Alt or Option if you need to. I'm going to paint over that spot I missed. There's some spots on the dark layer that I missed. I'm going to fill those in. We know there's going to be a leaf here, so let's turn our reference back on and let's put that leaf in front of the rest of the layers. And that looks like it's kind of a bluish green color. We think of it as green, but you want to actually look at what color it actually is because it's color cast a little bit. So I think it's something kind of like that will work for one of the darker colors in the leaf. This, since it's going to be a more specific shape, we want to try a little bit harder just to paint it in accurately. That'll just save us some time later having to correct that. And again, this doesn't have to be the exact same shape as the leaf in the photo. You can change this. Alright, so if we turn off our reference layer, it's not going to look like we really did much. It's just a bunch of blobs, but we're going to add more and more layers of color, and that'll help to pull this together. So we'll turn our reference image back on. Let's go to the roses foreground layer. Let's add a new layer, and let's call this roses foreground shadow. And for this, we're going to want kind of a dark reddish purple, like so. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you want it to be lighter in value than your dark color that you used. So if you need to turn off your reference layer and sample that dark color, you'll see that it's a 13. So any dark purple that we pick or dark pink that we pick needs to be lighter than that. So you want to make sure that when you pick your color, it's greater than 13, but still pretty close to it if you want it to be dark. So something like that will work. Turn your reference back on and then make sure you're painting on the roses foreground shadow layer. I'm going to use a smaller brush now, and I'm going to start putting in some of these areas here. Now you want to make sure that the strokes you use complement the direction of the flow of the object. So, you know, I'm not going to put in, like let's say here where there's these curves and lines and things, I'm following the contour of the petal. I'm not just going to paint against it in some really unnatural way like that, because in this style it's not what I'm going for. But you also want to be loose. You don't really want to spend forever focusing on the details. You want this to look kind of rough and painted if you're going for an impressionist style, and in this case I am. And I'm not going to worry about getting every single color. I'm just going to get the basic idea of this. Again, just think about it like you're blurring your eyes and you're focusing on particular colors. Right now I'm just focusing on these dark magenta or dark pink colors and just filling those in. You really want to use your pen pressure here too. Really vary your pen pressure. You'll notice I'm getting these thin lines, I'm getting thick lines, I'm getting all these different shapes. Let's add another layer. Let's call this roses foreground mid. And mid will be short for mid-tone. This will be a less dark shadow color. So we kind of put on the highlights first. I mean, there's going to be lighter spots than this, but this is kind of the lighter pink color. And so we're putting on some of the darker pink colors as a layer. So let's go ahead and shift the hue a little bit. Let's get a color maybe more like this. And let's go ahead and add in these mid-tone areas now. So the more layers of color you add, the more realistic and the more three-dimensional this is going to look. It's kind of up to you to decide how many colors you want to add and how much detail you want to add. The problem I have with cloning and auto painting, because I know you could do this with the cloning and auto painting too, is that it doesn't really give you much creative freedom. The computer just does what it wants, and you end up with a certain result that you can of course modify to get it to look the way you want, but it doesn't let you pick your own colors and brush strokes. It doesn't let you, I mean, you can kind of customize that stuff, but it doesn't give you as much creative authority. It doesn't force you to make those decisions yourself, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. And it's good to make those decisions. If you want this to look like something that you painted in your style, you have to have a style. You can't rely on the computer to paint something and then have you tweak it. That's the computer's style. And computers aren't good at being creative. They're just good at performing a task. And really copying over that painting is just the computer going through a sequence that somebody programmed that was just a broad generalization of how to make a painting. That's not being creative, and as much as you want to call that art, it's not. You are the one who has to be creative as the person, as the human being. If you're relying on the computer to be creative for you, that's not art. That's just a simulation of art. Now, this is tracing. It's not cloning, though. It's not auto painting. I'm making these decisions as a human being of where I'm going to put each of these brush strokes. They're not just the same stroke mechanically repeated over the painting, getting the exact color. I'm not even picking the color from in the photo here. I could use this dropper, but what's the fun in that? Why not just learn to see the color and learn to pick colors? That way, if you want to paint your own roses and you don't want to have to rely on a photo, you can do that. Now, I'm not knocking cloning or people who do cloning. I've done plenty of cloning in my day. That's how I got started doing digital painting, but you do want to move beyond that, because that's the only way you're going to grow as an artist. There's a lot to learn from painting from scratch, and as you can see in this example here, it's really not that hard. There's nothing wrong with tracing. Plenty of professional artists do it. Some people are against it. If you want to clone, clone. If you want to paint freehand, paint freehand. If you want to trace, trace. You do whatever you want, because that's what art is all about. There aren't any rules about what you can or can't do. Everybody has their opinions. Of course, I have my opinions that I've expressed here, but that's just my opinion. It doesn't mean that that's the right or wrong way to do things. See, I'm just complimenting what's there. I'm not painting against things. I'm painting with the shapes, and I'm not trying to copy it directly. All I'm really trying to look at is the general shape of what's underneath, and I'm using this framework, this tracing, as a guide, and then I'm using my reference photo just to pick colors by eye. So if we turn our reference off for a second and we zoom out, you'll see this is starting to look like a painting of some roses. Now, it's going to need more layers of color for it to look more realistic and more three-dimensional, and we'll keep adding those. It's up to you how many layers you want to add. Let's add another layer, and let's call this Roses Foreground, HL. That'll be short for highlight. And we'll want to pick a really light pink, something like this. And in our photo, we'll want to look for these really light areas now, just the lightest of the light. And then switch your pink a little bit darker in value, but still keep it pretty saturated. And these will be kind of surrounding that area. If I turn off my reference photo, you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to create kind of a gradient effect when I blend this stuff. Let's add some other colors of pink in here. Let's try some of these brighter ones. Now, you don't have to keep your reference photo on at all times too. You can feel free to turn that off as you desire. Just adding a little bit more flavor here and there so that we don't have this one static color. Let's sample this pink using Alt or Option. Add in a little bit of that. At a certain point when you get more confident painting, you don't really need to use these layers so much, and we will eventually flatten these layers down to a single layer. So let's go ahead and just do that now. Let's just see how that works. We're abandoning our framework because at this point everything is so filled in and so sloppy, you can't even really see your reference image anymore when it's overlaid, so we got rid of that. It's all one layer, and now if we want to paint, we can continue adding layers if we need to, or we can just paint on this single layer image, and I think we'll do that. Let's add some brighter green to the edge of this. We add in a darker green for a shadow. Apply some vein pattern. Light highlight on that. Sample this dark purple color. Let's make it slightly less dark, and let's use this to add a little more shading. Now here I kind of know the general shape that I'm going for. Since I've been tracing over this so much, I've kind of memorized this spiral pattern. Made the observation that there's that pattern there, and now I'm trying to follow that. This rose is kind of turned on the side, so we want to paint it slightly differently. Some of these are just random petals. And then down here, you can't even really make out what this is, so just use your imagination. Just fill stuff in. You have to fill in the gaps. That's another thing the computer can't do. It just paints things as they are. You paint things how you see them, and that's what makes art interesting. Okay, so let's zoom out and see how close we're getting to a painting. It's starting to look closer. It's always good to zoom out. So when you print this, if this is going to be an 8x10 print, it's not going to be this big. You're not going to be able to see it this close unless you're standing like right up on it. So we'll try to keep things in perspective. Now I'm going to blend a little bit to make this look a little more painterly and smooth out some of these transitions. I'm going to use the coarse oily blender. You want to make sure that you're just blending on a single layer. You don't want to have multiple layers, because if you try to blend a free-floating layer here, if I add something here, let's say like this green area, if I blend that, you're going to get this weird white fringe that happens on the edge of your layer. So use a drop all, make sure you're only blending on a single layer. We'll use the coarse oily blender. Your paper texture is going to affect how your blender functions. So you want to make sure that you pick a paper texture that you like, and then these settings here control the scale of the grain and the contrast. So you'll get more of a smeary effect with a lower setting on your contrast, and you'll get more of a streaky effect with this setting. So if I do a little test, you can see what it's going to do. There's that grain in the smudge, and the smudginess is controlled by this setting here. So if I set this lower, I do that same stroke, you can see it smudges more of it with less grain. So I want something like this, and what I want to do is I want to paint kind of following the direction of the brush strokes, and I want to stay, if I'm going to blend the leaf, I want to make sure I'm staying on the leaf. I don't want to just go like this and just mess up all my detail. So I'm going to blend kind of following the brush strokes that I already established to make this look a little more organic. You'll see I'm being very careful about where I paint. I'm not just painting haphazardly, because you want to keep some of these sharp areas. You have to think about the form of what you're shading too. So here there's the contours of the petals. If they're going in a spiral, I'm blending kind of in a spiral direction. The most important thing though is that you don't blend away all of your detail, because you'll end up at square one where it's going to look like you didn't do anything at all. Now this is going to be an additive and a subtractive process, so we are going to have to add more paint on top of this. Alright, so I think I have most of the edges blended that I wanted to blend. Now it looks a lot more like a painting, huh? So we can compare it to our photograph here. Looks a lot like some roses, and all it took was a little bit of blending. So you can see it doesn't really take that much effort to make a painting look realistic without using the cloning or the auto painting feature. In fact, it might even take more effort using the cloning or auto painting to get it to look like an organic painting by having to spend a lot of time adding little imperfections and things. So of course we can keep adding to this, and we can keep adding more and more layers of color. I think we'll add a few more layers, but it's up to you to decide when to stop. If you want this to look more impressionistic, don't add too much to it. If you want it to look really photorealistic, keep adding more and more colors and more shades of pink in here to make these look more three-dimensional, and try to match the shapes more to what you see in the photo. Well, let's add a few more layers of color, and we can play with the composite methods here. For instance, we could change this to multiply if we want it to tint what's underneath. Let's pick kind of a more reddish color here, something like that. And let's play with some other brushes. Let's use the airbrush. Let's just tint the center of this. We tint part of that one, part of that one. Let's pick kind of a lighter blue color. Let's add some blue to kind of give this a sense of shadow. Let's cool off this green a little bit. It's a little too bright. And maybe we'll even add some green in here. And what we can do is we can subtract from this a little bit using white. If you paint with white onto a multiply composite method, it's going to erase basically. So anywhere that you may have overpainted with that dark, you can subtract from it a little bit. If I turn that layer on and off, you can see the effect it's having. Now of course we can go through and we can blend that too. If we want this edge to look more painterly and less soft, we can go through and add more blending. If you wanted to add highlights, you could do the same thing, but this time set it to screen. Pick a bright pink like that. Maybe let's use the glow brush this time. Let's use a dark pink on the glow brush, and what that will do is that'll really just make these edges pop. This is going to show up better on a darker area. We'll make it a little bit brighter so it pops more. There we go. Usually this brush works better if it doesn't build to light too fast, but in this case, there's a lot of light areas on the petals, so I think that's okay. Now I'm kind of breaking away from like a traditional oil painting style here. I'm making this a little more modern by using this brush, but that's another thing that you should be aware of, is that you don't have to only use the oil brushes to do an oil painting. You don't only have to use the pencil to do a pencil drawing. You can combine any of these brushes at any time to make any kind of painting that you want to make. Let's go ahead and drop all the layers again. Let's blend some more. Let's see how I take that from looking really digital to looking more organic just by blending it. I think that really helps for this particular style. Sometimes I want things to look digital. Sometimes I don't. It's nice to fool people sometimes and have people look at stuff and go, is that something you did in acrylic or is that something you did on the computer? I like to just let them guess. And now if we want to add a nice canvas texture over this to help it look even more organic, we can create a new layer. Let's call it texture. And let's select this 5. This will be a very neutral gray. We'll go to fill. Now you're probably wondering, why the heck are we filling the canvas with gray? Well, don't worry about it. Let's use another composite method here, which is called overlay. Now that has a magical effect of making that gray disappear, but if you were to add a canvas texture, that would still show up, because the texture is lighter and darker than that exact value of gray. So whichever paper we have selected is going to define whichever paper texture we end up with by default, but we can still change that. We will go to Effects, Surface Control, Apply Surface Texture. And if we don't want that paper texture, we can pick something else. Let's pick the gessoed canvas, make this look a little more like canvas. If you want to control the size of the grain, unfortunately you'll have to go ahead and back out of that and change the size here. And I think I'll go ahead and do that because I want the canvas texture to be a little bit bigger. So I'm going to do an undo, and I'm going to go to Effects, Surface Control, Apply Surface Texture again. And now you can see that grain is a lot bigger. It tends to fit better if this is going to be an 8x10. I want it to be a more realistic size of grain. We'll go to OK. And since that texture is on its own layer, we can go back to the canvas layer, which is all the paint underneath, and we can still blend that and paint on it without worrying about covering up that texture. If you want to sharpen these edges, you can pull in some of the background, for instance, and kind of clean it up. Now, of course, now when I'm blending, I'm getting the paper texture that I have selected from the gessoed canvas rather than that texture I had before, so you may or may not want that texture. If you don't like it, you can always change it back to basic paper. That's what we were using before. I think that looks pretty good for the paint underneath. So let's modify our texture a little bit to make it look a little bit more organic. Let's go ahead and save our artwork. You can save as a PSD or as a RIF, it's up to you. I like PSD. And we're saving because sometimes when we use masks, it can crash our computer, especially if your computer is kind of on the slower side. So we're going to do that here. We're going to create a mask. Hopefully it won't crash the computer though. Click on the mask to make sure it's selected. Select black as your color. And then we're going to use the sponge. We're going to use a pretty big sponge. We're going to paint. Now it's not going to seem like it's doing much. You're going to have to go back and forth over it a few times. But what it's doing is it's here and there, it's masking out or concealing some of that texture. So it's kind of more or less erasing it, but not erasing all of it, just little spots here and there. What that's going to do is that's going to make it look more organic, because if you were to do a painting on a canvas, once you put the paint on, it's going to cover up more or less of that canvas texture. It's not going to be so even. We can create another new layer. Let's call it texture 2. I like to add a couple layers of texture to help it look even more interesting. We'll make sure that's an overlay composite method, and we'll select that gray color, that number 5. We'll do fill. It's not going to look like anything happened because we set the composite method first, so basically it's just that gray, but it's invisible now. And let's pick a different texture. Let's pick something a little more rough, like simulated wood grain. We'll go to Effects, Surface Control, Apply Surface Texture. And it's okay if it's really rugged like that. I think I like that. We'll go to OK, and we will add a mask to that. We'll select black, and we'll use the sponge, and we'll paint away some of that. You could also use the chalk brush, you could use the airbrush, you could use any brush you want. I want it to look kind of textured, so these chalk and sponge brushes work a little bit better. Let's try the chalk. That'll do the work a little bit faster there. And you can see it's removing some of that texture, but not all of it. And then a couple places here and there makes the paint look nice and thick. And when you're done, you can go ahead and drop all your layers, and you can save this as your final version. And if you're going to post this to the web, I recommend that you save as a PNG. You'll want to save a copy of your artwork, of course. You don't want to save over your original. It's best to keep your original as a RIF or a PSD. So PNG for the web, that's better than JPEG, because JPEG can change the color of your image and ruin the quality of it because it compresses your image to make it smaller. TIFF is very good for printing. I always save my prints if I'm going to print on canvas or on paper. I'll do those with a TIFF. But if I'm posting for web, I use PNG. So I'm going to go ahead and save a copy as a PNG. Call it Roses 2, and now I can post this on the web. So there you go. That's how you can use a reference photo as a guide to do a painting that looks like a painting and not like a cloned or auto-painted photograph using Corel Painter 2015. If you found this information helpful, take a quick second to like this video and share it with your friends, and don't forget to click the subscribe button to see my new videos as I release them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.